safety like scared little girls? No, there are no threats of violence. In fact, people were urging them, why don't you tell us what you want so you can get the hell out of here? Right? No, that's not how, but according to them, it is inherently unsafe for people to disagree with you. It is inherently unsafe for people to disagree with you under any circumstances whatsoever. And now, of course, we have to host safe spaces for everybody. So if somebody wears a stupid costume to a UW football game, right, then we have to hold a safe space for that, right? This happened like a couple of weeks ago here. You had to hold a safe space because somebody wore a costume to the football game that was a jailbird costume. On one side was Hillary Clinton's face, on the other side was Obama's face, and then somebody dressed up as Trump and a rope around the neck. Okay, it wasn't a lynching thing. It was leading around a prisoner. And by the way, it wasn't a lynching thing also because Hillary Clinton is a white woman. But it doesn't matter. Everything has to be construed in the worst possible light, even stupid costumes. And then we have to have safe spaces. So you have somebody like LaRuth McAfee, who's Assistant Dean of Diversity, Inclusion, and Uselessness. And she writes, "It pains me to be sending out yet another email advertising a safe space hosted by the Multicultural Graduate Network and the Black Graduate and Professional Studies Association because, in theory, students should feel safe in any space on this campus. In wake of the recent events that have occurred, they're offering a safe space for grad students hurt by this to come and relax, vent, and or just enjoy one another's company." First of all, I'm just going to argue with this. When LaRuth McAfee says it pains her to send out yet another email advertising a safe space, it does not pain her. That's literally why she gets paid. If there were no safe spaces, she would be out of a job. They need to create need for safe spaces, otherwise administrators get fired. Right? But the left won't ever say grow up to anybody unless you're on the right. Unless you're on the right. So the same administration that declared a safe space because of a costume says it's okay for one of its students to sell hoodies that say all white people are racist. The same student also marketed hoodies reading, quote, "If I encounter another cop with a God complex, I'm going to have to show the world that they are human." And the administration has nothing to say about that. UW said, "In this case, the individuals involved are exercising their rights to free speech and engaging in a private activity unrelated to their status as student." Ah, I get it. So now free speech is okay. Now free speech is okay. How convenient for everybody. I mean, again, I love the administration's decision here to suggest that if we have to sit around waiting for these idiots to leave for 20 minutes because if the police have to arrest anybody, they have to shut down the entire event. Right, so I can't speak and you can't listen if idiots get arrested, which makes perfect sense, except for not. Okay, safe spaces are safe in the same way that the Matrix is safe. It's nice and safe until you wake up and you realize that you're actually in a bucket of goo and there's a wire strapped into your head. As you can tell from our guests earlier, all of this is making college students totally insane. It's making them whiny, crybaby, insane people. And it makes them evil too. Because if you're constantly on the lookout to be a victim and you think you can act with violence to people who victimize you, you're going to end up hurting other people. You will. You'll end up doing bad things and hurting other people. It is important that we all get out of this victim group mentality and fight that mentality at every turn. Here's the truth. America is the safe space. And nobody cares enough to victimize you. No one cares about you. Your parents do. My kids care about me. My wife cares about me. My parents care about me. Nobody else cares about me. Great. I don't want people bothering me. I don't want people telling me things I can't do. The more, you may have noticed this from leftist government, the more people say they care about you, the more they want to bother you. Okay, but in America, nobody cares about you. It's your job to make your way in the world, and nobody is going to get in your way, because they don't spend every waking moment thinking about how to keep you down. They have other things to do. They have jobs, they have lives, they have children, they have wives, they have husbands, they have lovers. I mean, they have everything going on in their own life. They don't have time to worry about the whiny snowflake who's here on a state subsidy tuition. They don't. So the idea that you need a safe space from all these people, they don't care enough about you to worry about how to stop you. And that's the wonderful thing about America. And that's why we have to fight for every shred of freedom that we can keep. We have to fight every shred of political correctness. We have to stop this nonsense. Because the more of this fascistic nonsense there is, the more talk about social justice and white privilege and safe spaces and trigger warnings and microaggressions, the more of this nonsense there is, the less freedom there will be. And if we don't maintain that freedom, there will be no safe space for anyone. And we, all the people in this room now, all the people who are hearing my words, we are the dividing line between freedom and tyranny. Well, Ronald Reagan once said that freedom was always one generation away from extinction. Well, freedom is also always one generation away from revitalization. And we can be that generation if we stand up and stand together and stand for freedom. Thanks so much. Happy to take your questions.
All right. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, we will now open this time up for questions. I ask that you please keep your questions very short and specific, rather than giving a long narrative before asking your question. This ensures efficiency of the time we have available so that multiple questions can be asked. We will stop taking questions at 9 o'clock. If you have a question, please form a single file line on this by Harry, and remain silent until it is your turn to ask the question. Thank you.
Absolutely, of course. Really? All right. Alrighty, so let's get started. And yeah, we'll try to run through the questions relatively quickly because I know people have a lot of questions.
Hi, Mr. Shapiro. So I believe that the first half of the 21st century will be controlled by identity politics. I think the trend is clear considering we had the first women and orange man win party nominations. I want to know how a person who may not rely on identity politics can effectively make their voice heard over those who do.
Okay, so this is a really great question. I agree that what we've seen is the rise of identity politics on the left, and I think that there's actually a rise of identity politics on the right. It's why you see the rise of the so-called alt-right, which is an identity politics-driven group. The idea that white people need their own sort of political action group. And that's a problem to me. I'm not somebody who believes in identity politics. I think identity politics are actually evil. I don't think that you have your own interest group because of your race or your skin color or your ethnicity or any of that. So the only way to really speak to this is by going back to a message that I think we all chanted tonight, which is decency. Right? It's very easy to get tribal. People are inherently tribal. We all feel more for our families, as I said, than we do for people more broadly around us. The only way that you break that cycle is by having what they call social capital. And the way that social capital is created, the reason that I trust you, or that I trust my neighbor to babysit my kids, is to know that my neighbor is a decent person. So if we encourage everyone on an individual level to abide by decency, then you can break the never-ending cycle of identity politics. But that actually requires stuff to happen outside the realm of politics. It requires an upsurge in civic morality. It requires an upsurge in things like people going to church and joining together as communities. It requires a real move toward people talking about how to deal with each other morally on a non-governmental level. If you do all that, you can recreate a social fabric that has been torn apart by identity politics. Thanks a lot.
Hey, Ben, huge fan. First of all, my question for you is pretty simple, and that is the Republican Party the answer for conservatism in America?
So the Republican Party is just a tool, and as we've seen in this election cycle, it's a tool that's available for anyone to take over, right? So sometimes you're going to get a conservative leading the Republican Party, and sometimes you're going to get an ad hoc nationalist populist leading the Republican Party. It's the obligation of people who are conservative like me to try and fight inside the Republican Party to change the leadership if you don't like the leadership, and talk of third parties. Very difficult structurally to put together a third party. If Trump ends up driving the Republican Party far away from conservatism in a very clear and obvious way, you will see some rumblings about a third party because there are too many people who still believe in kind of root traditional conservatism to be thrown off by Trumpism. So it is the tool right now. Will it always be the tool? Not necessarily. The Whig Party was once the tool, presumably, and that fell away too. So things change.
Good evening, Mr. Shapiro. I have a question for you as a Harvard Law School graduate.
Sure.
Regarding the incident at Camp Randall, the man was asked to take off the quote-unquote noose around his head. Under the Brandenburg test, is this constitutionally able for the police to ask him to take off this rope, or is it considered free speech?
So, I mean, I assume that it's free speech under, the idea that it's not first of all, shouting fire in a crowded theater is based on a case that was Schenck, which has been debunked for 60 years. But yes, I'm not sure what the campus regulations are. There are policies that exist on campus that don't exist anywhere else in American life, and the Supreme Court has approved some of those things because there are time and space constraints. But if it's message specific, then you get into trouble. So it's at the very least, in my legal opinion, it's constitutionally questionable. That doesn't mean that I think it's a great idea or I think that it's a wonderful exercise of freedom of speech, but it is definitely questionable. Anytime there's a free speech question, I tend to lean on the side of free speech. And by the way, folks, if I'm answering to camera, that's only because there are people who are watching on the live stream, and it looks weird if I'm talking out here. So.
Mr. Shapiro, thank you for taking a principled stance criticizing Trump this election cycle. Thank you for introducing me to Harambe memes.
Well, that's his memory.
Last week, John Oliver used his show as a call to arms to support Planned Parenthood because Republicans have the House, the Senate, the White House. Do you anticipate pushback within the Republican Party if the pro-life movement tries to move forward with its agenda in the next 2 years?
I mean, this is a really good question. I'm not sure how committed Donald Trump is to, for example, reversing funding for Planned Parenthood, right? He said early in the primaries that he liked Planned Parenthood. He thought that they did some good work. It'll be interesting to see if he clashes with the new Congress over that, because clearly Paul Ryan and a lot of other members of Congress would like to withdraw federal funding for Planned Parenthood. Obviously, I think that's a good idea. I think abortion is immoral, and the idea that I'm paying for somebody else's baby to be killed seems pretty ridiculous, morally, ethically, legally to me. I think all of it's really dubious. It is definitely questionable. As far as John Oliver, we have a really bad habit in this country of taking everybody seriously if they have a British accent, and that seems to me a bad mistake. We ought to judge John Oliver by the content of his speech, not the quality thereof.
We've seen politics become more divisive and messy business, and as a result, arguably the most qualified people aren't running anymore. What would it take for you yourself to run for office? And then, do you think we'll ever get back to a time where those most qualified people want to be in politics and want to?
Well, I mean, there's always been sort of a disconnect between the right and the left in terms of qualified people going into public office. I will get to your first question. There's always been a disconnect because on the left, if you're really smart and qualified, you go into government. And on the right, if you're really smart and qualified, you go create things that help people and make millions of dollars. So what you end up with is this weird disconnect where the people who are on the Republican stage are all of sort of, with a few exceptions, they're all sort of middling IQ and not necessarily the world's greatest and smoothest orators. And on the Democratic side, you have a bunch of people with Ivy League degrees, except for this time around when you have an old crone who is going to be handed anyway. And also a loon bag old socialist who escaped from the asylum. So this time actually bucks the cycle a little bit. And so we end up with a race between the two least qualified candidates in American history. But all that said, what would it take for qualified people to jump in? First of all, people have to learn to love the fight, especially people of our generation. We have to learn to love the fight. Okay, the fight can be fun. This idea that there was ever civility and gentility in politics, not really. There was more kind of on an open level. But the fact is that back in 1800, if you read the scurrilous broadsides being published by the Adams campaign against the Jefferson campaign and back and forth, it was pretty rough stuff. I mean, you had a guy named James Callender, who's actually a muckraker for Thomas Jefferson, writing things about how John Adams was senile and he was running around the White House throwing his wig at people. Really. And meanwhile, you had muckrakers for Adams trying to discredit Alexander Hamilton, who was on Jefferson's side, and bringing up all the issues about him having adulterous affairs and all. So it's always been a rough business. I think that conservatives have to engage in that, and they have to like it. It's why people embrace Trump. It's because Trump actually comes off as aggressive. For all the problems I personally have with Trump morally, ethically, politically, the one thing that Trump is aggressive. And so it's going to take a new generation of aggressive conservatives. As far as would I ever run for office, I mean, honestly, in this day and age, I'm not sure I'm qualified. I'm not the son or the husband of a former president. So it's a pretty restrictive group of people who are allowed in, and I'm also not one of the Trump children, who I guess are next on the list. So I'll have to blame my father if I never run for office. It's his fault.
Thank you, Ben. Huge fan. Would you say it's possible for the left to recognize broken families as one of the biggest problems in American society? And if so, what would it take for the left to realize how big of a problem this is? Okay, so the left is never going to recognize that broken families are a problem because it is one of the goals of the left to break families. Historically speaking, if you read Marx and Engels, they do not like the traditional family. They think the traditional family is a bulwark against an overarching brutal state. Right, so the idea is, and they want the overarching brutal state, so therefore they don't want the family. The family is a bunch of people who care about each other more than they care about the community at large. And so this is why in Soviet Russia, the chief goal was to separate children from their family, have them turn on their parents. I mean, some of the great Soviet heroes in the Soviet Union were kids who reported their parents to the authorities. Right, so the left has never been in favor of traditional families. They see it as a threat. Because traditional families don't vote according to how the left wants them to vote. They vote in favor of leave me alone. I've got my family. It's my job to protect them. So the left is never going to stand up in favor of that to the detriment of everybody involved.
And therefore, it's incumbent on particularly religious people, because religion still has a significant amount of weight in American life, unlike in Europe. It's incumbent on religious people to make sure that their kids understand the value of family. It's incumbent on secular thinkers to make clear to people that broken homes, that single motherhood is not an affirmative good. And when Hollywood tells these lies, a great book by Charles Murray it's called Coming Apart, and it's actually about white poor people, white poverty versus white wealth. And he says one of the problems is a lot of people who exist in the white wealthy sphere, people in Hollywood, they live like traditionally religious people, but they preach like far leftists. So they'll be married, they'll have kids, they'll have the same divorce rate as kind of normal folks, but then they'll preach that all families are created equal. And look, this is not to say there can't be great single moms. There can. It's not to say there can't be crappy two-parent homes. Of course there can. But on a general level, if you are born into a two-parent family, you do have an advantage over people who are born into a one-parent family. It is everybody in this room's responsibility to live out these ideals, teach them to your kids, and teach them to all the people around you, regardless of race. Okay, and I understand there are people. I spoke at a school called Otay Ranch High School in San Diego, and it's a largely low-income minority crowd. I don't know how the public school approved it, but they did. And so I was speaking to them, and at one point I said exactly what I've said here. Single motherhood is a predictor of poverty. And if you're impoverished for all of your adult life in the United States, it's because you're not good with money. It's because you make bad decisions with your money. And the principal actually walked down and shut down the speech and excused the entire class if they wanted to leave, because he said there are too many kids here who are products of single mothers, and they might be offended. If you can't tell people the truth because they might be offended, we're never going to get anywhere here. So we have to tell people the truth regardless of whether it offends them, because the truth is the only thing that's going to make them more free and more prosperous.
Hi.
Howdy.
Fact number one. Transgender is not a disease. This is not my opinion. This is facts from the World Health Organization and the American Psychology Association. Just like gay people don't have a disease. Fact number two. Rich kids stay rich, poor kids stay poor.
It's not true.
Out of 1,800 billionaires in the world, 12 of them are black. Where you come from, where you grow up, how much your parents earn, whether your parents were married plays a major role in determining where you
is there a question mark at the end?
Fact number three. I would just like to remind you that hate speech is not free speech.
Yes, it is.
And my question is, since facts don't care about your feelings, why did you use false facts?
Okay, so none of the facts that I used are false. First of all, yes. No, okay, first of all, would you like the answer? Okay, so the three facts you mentioned, you talked about transgenderism. First of all, until 5 minutes ago, the DSM specifically defined transgenderism as a disorder. It defined it as gender identity disorder, now calls it gender dysmorphia, which doesn't even make sense. It says that depression is the actual problem, not the actual gender disorder, which again does not explain why the transgender suicide rate is upward of 40%, and the actual suicide rate for the rest of the American population is lower than 3%. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, you talked about income inequality, and you suggested that all wealth is inherited. This is nonsense. According to the IRS statistics, if you are born into the bottom 20% of wage earners in the United States, you will not be one of the bottom 20% of wage earners in the United States. 90% of people will not be within 15 years. There's tremendous wage mobility in the United States of America. Plus, there is not a group of people who just sit at the very top and stay there. People move up and down, in and out of the 1%. 1% just defines the line of income. It doesn't define the people who are in that 1% of income. I've been in the 1%, I've been out of the 1%. It will happen to lots of people. People who are older tend to be more likely to be in the 1%. They weren't once in the 1%. What happened? Okay, so that's number two. Number three, you say hate speech is not free speech. It depends how you define hate speech. The only speech that is not free speech is speech that overtly defends or pushes violence. Specifically, speech that is generating violence, right? That's the only type of speech that's not hate speech. If I say things you don't like, that's not hate speech. And if you think that it is hate speech, you're a fascist. End of story.
Hey Ben, big fan. Two things. One, I'd like to call my brother Anders. Hey Anders, someone out there watching the live stream. Number two, I debate socialists all the time, and their only real comeback is, well, that's not real socialism, or that's not real communism. Is there any way to really get around that and try to make them see that, look, just because your version of socialism, that magical fantasy land version of socialism, has not been tried, doesn't mean that socialism is an acceptable concept.
So the problem is that you're arguing with them in terms of the effectiveness of socialism. So what that argument is, you say socialism doesn't work, it fails everywhere, makes people poor and miserable, right? That's the argument. And then they go, but that's because it hasn't been properly tried, right? That's their comeback. Here is the actual argument that works with socialism. It is immoral to steal from people even if you vote to steal from people. Okay, if there are 3 people in a room, and it's me, and I have $100, and you and your friend are in the room, and you vote to beat me up and take my money, that does not make it morally legitimate for you to beat me up and take my money. One of the great lies that's been told about socialism, and you see this all the time, is people say socialism, beautiful idea in theory, but it doesn't work in practice. No, socialism is a shitty idea in theory, and it's an immoral idea in practice. Okay, socialism violates at least 3 of the basic 10 commandments for those who still care. It makes government into God. It suggests that you can steal from people if you vote for it, and it says that it is good to be covetous of your neighbor's ass. Right? For Bill Clinton, it has a different meaning, but. The problem for conservatives is we never actually argue on a moral level. We're constantly arguing on an effective level, on an efficiency level. And that's a problem because the left always argues on the moral level. In the end, they always say, sure, my ideas don't work, but they're fair. They're fair, right? And so what you have to say, the only way to come back to that from that is to say, no, your ideas are not fair, your ideas are theft. Your ideas are theft. You don't get to steal from other people just because you want their stuff. That's the only way to beat that argument. Do it on the moral level. Otherwise, they can always argue, well, it's not perfect. It's not perfect. Okay, there's no way to come back from that because, again, they're operating in unicorn land with gumdrop rainbows and fairy skies. Thanks.
Hey, Ben. Or I'm sorry. Your Grace.
Thank you. Thank you for not stealing my identity from me.
Yes, of course. I want to be polite here, obviously. Anyways, so
respect the pronouns.
Yeah. One, how'd you become a Cubs fan? Or, I'm sorry, a White Sox fan. Yeah.
How dare you?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Your Grace, please forgive me. Please forgive me. Pray for me tonight. 2, do I have the honor, Your Grace, to shake your hand? And then 3, how do we fix the education system in America? Because as you know, the K-12 system is really kind of falling apart in the inner cities. Our model is pretty much outdated. It's something that's been used since the 1920s.
Yeah.
Secondary education is also kind of what, as we just saw from the precious cupcakes outside.
Yeah.
If you major in lesbian dance theory, as you like to say,
yeah,
you get a $200,000 education and you can't get a job.
Right.
What do you think the solution would be to that?
Okay, so first of all, on the White Sox question, my dad and mom are from Chicago. My dad was a White Sox fan. I inherited all of his rooting interests, and it's been a really bizarre year for me. I mean, really, between the Cubs winning the World Series and a reality TV show star winning the presidency, it's been interesting. So as far as shake my hand, be happy to do that if security allows it. And as far as the education system, the only answer in the education system is, of course, the same as it is in any other market-based system. You need a market. Right? If you grant vouchers, if you grant charter schools, if you pay teachers according to their product, if they perform better, you pay them more. If they don't perform, you fire them. Or you actually have to have a free market system that involves local control because in the end, parents are going to be the ones who have to choose what's in the best interest of their child. It's also going to take a bit of civic re-education because the fact is that this has nothing to do with color. There are lots of miseducated kids in this country because education is not taken seriously in a lot of communities across the country. And so people are going to have to, be told that, and they're going to have to learn that education matters a lot. And you can see this. I mean, in the Jewish community, education's always been a priority, and that's why Jews have always been very highly educated, regardless of the society in which they live. Americans have typically been highly educated, too, because we respect and value education. One of the ways to do that is by giving control back to the parents and making it their responsibility. The more government steps in, the more parents step out. And that's been true in every aspect of the private sector. The more government steps into welfare, the less people give charity. The more the government tries to regulate morality, the less the church does. Right? The fact is that the bigger government is, the less private choice there is, and private choice is the only way of guaranteeing quality of any product. When people declare a right to education, a right means that you have the ability to secure what you're looking for from somebody else, presumably.